bit to share from the all-party walking and cycling group, where they had, this was on Monday, and had 3 speakers talking about the kind of economics of active and sustainable travel. I'll pick out one area just to update on, which is Martin Key, who's the head of strategy at Active Travel England, formerly of Greater Manchester, where I'm based. Basically, Active Travel England are creating their new strategic plan, but part of that is going to be an associated piece of work, which is an evidence base, setting out effectively the business case for active travel, setting out the economic case very clearly. It talked about how when they did their recent survey of councils, asking them to categorise themselves, the higher performing councils all spoke in quite eloquent and data-led terms about the benefits to health and housing, etc. Interesting listening to Martin talking about how Highways England, when they were sort of coming into formation and setting out their priorities, did exactly this. They created the economic case for the Strategic Roads Network, SRN for short, which was called Road to Growth, which, you know, kind of sticks in my throat as a phrase, because we're not pro roads in this forum, but in terms of that being a model for what Active Travel England are trying to do, it was really smart work. We all know the economic arguments, but they're not necessarily easy to find, and so if Active Travel England are pulling all this together, this sounded good news. Same webinar, Sustrans is the guy from Sustrans, Tim Burns, also set out the Walking and Cycling Index, which shows that there's a £36 billion economic benefit of walking and cycling. And interesting that this economic case is basically going to be built on the 5 pillars of improving health and road safety, enhancing road connectivity, unlocking new development, i.e. housing, supporting jobs and growth, and boosting local economics. So a very strong kind of economic case. And I'm looking forward to seeing the evidence that is included within that, which Martin talked about. They've got evidence from 8 cities in England now that show that a significant reduction in car miles as a result of the investment that they've put in, which ties into the government's decarbonisation plan. And also the benefits of reducing congestion, and how much this is going to form part of this evidence base. So I thought it was really good to hear that Active Travel England are doing this, and I think, you know, I'm certainly going to try and get Martin on to talk about this in the new year in more detail. So that's a bit of a longer update than I would normally give, but it's really interesting. Adam.
Yeah, just to say that Bath and North East Somerset have launched their first of, well, they're launching or signed off the ETROs for what they're calling livable neighbourhoods, which are effectively low traffic neighbourhoods. These are quite simple ones, but and those are all going in this week, which is good. But we do have an election coming next May, so let's hope they go quite well. There's another 11 in the pipeline, but they're much more complex, with 11 sort of community workshops that have already happened, and designs and haven't as yet spilled out for those, but the first 4 have just gone in. But thought that might be quite interesting.
Thanks, Adam. The other thing just to mention from the all-party group was this wasn't kind of a specific element of the webinar, but it was kind of touched on in passing. Obviously, we had the spending review last week, the budget, and you know, not much, no detail in there about what will happen to the funding for Active Travel England, but there are a few comments made in that webinar that sounds like potentially any sort of fears about big funding cuts aren't going to happen, but that was kind of very much referred to in passing. I don't know if people saw a couple of weeks ago that there was a question to the House about what the cost of active travel in the active travel objectives contained in the decarbonisation plan would be, and the answer was about £9.9 billion, covering to the period to 2030. And obviously at the moment there's still only that 2 billion allocated, so hopefully, we still don't know this for sure yet, but the spending review won't result in even that 2 billion being reduced. If anyone does know any more about that, do share. So we wait to see. Right, I'll just have a quick look at the chat, see if anything else has popped up. Otherwise, I think we might be ready to hear from Leanne and Harriet. Can't see so. So at this point then, I'll ask Leanne and Harriet to, I'll hand over to you guys for your talk on active travel in Jersey.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'll just share my screen. We've got some slides. We've just got some photos to share. Bear with me a sec. I'll just bring this up. So hopefully you can all see that.
That's great.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks so much for having us. So we were just going to chat to you about our kind of network planning that we did in Jersey, kind of some of the things that in terms of infrastructure that they've kind of already got over there, kind of our experience. We're very lucky we did get a site visit out of this work. So yeah, so just quickly introducing ourselves. There we go. So I'm Leanne Brooke, obviously principal consultant at PJA. I've been working for almost 9 years now, predominantly in planning the whole time, but most recently in the last kind of 3 or 4 years, kind of moving over to active travel. So really enjoying it. I'm also a cyclist as well. So yeah, it's nice to do work in something that I also enjoy. And I'll let Harriet introduce herself.
Thanks, Leanne. Yep, hi everyone. I'm Harriet Holdenby. It's really nice to see you all. I'm an urban designer at PGA, but specialising in active travel. So I've been here for, I think, just over 1.5 years now, but started my career at Sustrans as well. So yeah, it's been kind of active travel from day one for me.
Great. So yeah, there were a couple of stages involved in this project work, and I just kind of talked through kind of the stages that we kind of go through. Stage 1 is predominantly desktop evidence led, kind of setting out the baseline. We used the kind of LC-WIP guidance, which is obviously the local cycling walking infrastructure plan guidance in terms of kind of looking at how we map desire lines and looking at where the demand is. We look at things like obviously census data, albeit obviously that's of 2011 now, and obviously the 2021 data would be interesting to see what we kind of get out of that. But we also kind of developed a methodology where we start looking at everyday trips as well. So we're trying to map where those desire lines. Obviously Jersey, obviously they have a lot of tourism, so leisure cycling is obviously an important part to the island. So for that we looked at the Strava data, and on that top image there, that's the Strava data outputs that we had. So as you would probably imagine, a lot of the desire lines hugged the coastal routes. Obviously we looked at walking routes as well, and that's that bottom map that we had. Generally in terms of the kind of the cycling infrastructure, we kind of resulted in identifying 3 route typologies for the roads within Jersey. We also had routes on rural roads, we had routes within villages, and then kind of key routes into St Helier, and so that kind of characterized the routes that we would be looking at. Stage 2 is when we had the opportunity to go out to the island, and that mainly involved with prioritizing the network. So we obviously had identified the desire lines through the data, and it's kind of getting out there and looking at lots of options for those desire lines and looking at the routes and identifying where the biggest kind of opportunities for kind of that infrastructure was. Obviously Jersey is very constrained, a lot of the roads are very narrow, so not a terrible amount of opportunity for kind of segregated cycling infrastructure. So it was more about looking at what we could do to slow the vehicles down, and kind of make the conditions suitable for cycling. So initially, obviously, to try and cover as much ground as possible, we initially kind of got in the car and drove all of the routes. So there were several routes for each desire line, and we could immediately discount some of the routes for perhaps gradient challenges. And then we kind of got on the bikes and cycled them to develop kind of a prioritized route. And then also we looked at identifying kind of interventions along those routes as well, to improve them. Just interestingly, we saw a lot of electric bike use over on the island. Obviously, being an island, it can be obviously gradient challenges, but it didn't really stop people. Lots of people out on electric bikes. And just generally in terms of the attitude, especially out in the rural areas, a lot of drivers are very courteous, kind of waving us on. Although we did kind of notice a difference when we got to the more kind of St Helier and the more built up areas, so that was quite interesting. So from that work, we had a range of technical outputs. So we we kind of had a technical report which kind of went through all the toolkits that we used to prioritize and how we scored and how we audited all of the routes. And then we had a bit more of a glossy design recommendation booklet, which is that bottom image there on the right of your screen, where we kind of looked at the routes and we identified the kind of interventions and opportunities. We provided costings for each of the routes, and that kind of all fed into a bit of a delivery plan. And that included kind of considerations to prioritization, and we thought obviously where we could maybe get quick wins and where perhaps the kind of data showed that there was the greatest opportunity to accommodate, you know, where we could see the opportunity for short trips that perhaps people were undertaking by car, kind of, yeah, looking at where we should prioritize the kind of infrastructure and improvements. And then the kind of the final stage of this work stream is a mobility plan for St Helier. We're just starting this work, so this will be really interesting. We don't have any conclusions for that yet, but so we've just had ANPR surveys commissioned, so that will look at all the vehicles entering St Helier from within the ring road, and we can find out from that data things like dwell time, so we can see if people are driving in and spending the day there, perhaps if a vehicle enters the ring road and immediately exits on the other side, and we can kind of have a look at how much of that's through traffic. Obviously the aim to reduce as much of the car movements as possible and kind of create a better place for walking and cycling. So yeah, we're kind of undertaking, this is mainly a data-led exercise again, to see if what interventions we can propose. But the aim is the kind of a mobility plan. The things that we'll be looking at is, you know, does the data support these kind of traffic circulation plans? So we've got an image on the screen there. I think this is where we kind of divide the city up into quadrants, and so looking at the traffic circulation plans in Groningen and Ghent. I know that one was recently implemented in Brussels. It's also a plan for Birmingham, as I probably should have said, sorry, I'm from Birmingham and my colleagues from Manchester. So we're obviously seeing a lot of the infrastructure going in on the ground. So the principles of this is that for people driving, you kind of drive forced out onto the ring road and kind of enter and exit the quadrants, but it restricts through movements for vehicles whilst allowing full permeability for everyone walking and cycling. And this is obviously, I think Groningen in the Netherlands is the first one. I think it was in 1977 from memory, and was quite successful in terms of reducing car trips and kind of increasing cycling trips. So that's what we're looking at, hopefully the data supporting this kind of scheme. So I just pass on to Harriet to talk about some of the kind of things we saw on the island.
Thanks, Leanne. Yeah, so as we were sort of gallivanting, we were absorbing some really nice practice that we saw out there and that we wanted to bring back and share with kind of colleagues and beyond. So the first two being that Jersey has a national speed limit of 40 miles an hour, and the second one being that they've designated 67 miles of their roads currently as green lanes. And certainly kind of in the work we're doing, we're sort of increasingly working in more rural areas, in market towns, places like that. So it's important for us, but also, as you know, a lot of people on this call will be aware, rural roads are sort of pose a real threat to people walking and cycling. They're kind of, you know, they're often not really designed to be driving at those top speeds. They're narrow, they're windy, they're often unlit, and it poses a lot of dangers. And they, you know, they take a real share of the casualties that we do see on the road. So this was quite an important point for us to observe. My colleague's correcting me. Sorry, yeah, we were working very hard, not gallivanting. And it's very distracting. So yeah, so I think, you know, the 40 miles an hour national speed limit, it's still quite fast if you're sharing the road with cars, but it's a really important start for curving those more extreme speeds. And then in terms of the green lanes, if anyone's not familiar with those at all, as part of the designation, the speed limit is 15 miles an hour, and priority is given to people walking, cycling, horse riding. And the idea is that these roads are just for access to properties. And actually there's quite a kind of generous attitude towards tourists driving down them as well. And what we felt was that they worked, by and large, they worked really quite well. And where they perhaps weren't quite weren't quite achieving those lower speeds and things we were talking about, you know, rural modal filters. And actually they worked so well that kind of as we were getting used to them, we were kind of cycling a bit faster to get out of the way of cars, and actually got told off by a local for speeding in a joking way. So that was our sort of introduction to how well these roads were working. So that was really fantastic to see. And of course, you know, things like that, we're starting to move a bit more towards this here. And we've had the 20-mile-an-hour trials in Cornwall, Wales and the Scottish borders within built-up areas. And obviously Wales have now passed this legislation. And there's also talks around Surrey starting to kind of trial, you know, 20, 30, 40 mile per hour speeds on roads that are actually currently 60 miles an hour and a little bit more rural. So that's, as far as I'm aware, currently online and open for comments. Leanne, if you want to go on to the next one, please. So another thing we saw, we sort of came across these a bit by accident. We did a bit of a double take and went, they've not got Belisha beacons. So the Jersey style crossing, it's very much kind of the zebra crossing we know and love, but they've not got the requirements in all locations. They're a little bit hazy on what those locations were, where they don't have to apply the Belisha beacon. And obviously, you know, there's cost savings in terms of that. So it's much easier to roll these out. And then it means that they can actually be incorporated really well, as in this example here in St. Albans. Into kind of placemaking schemes. It works really nicely. The kind of sight lines to this one were really good. You've obviously got some lovely carriageway narrowing going on to support that. And this is actually an A road in true Jersey style. You wouldn't really know from looking at it, but yeah, I think it's the A13, if I remember correctly. And obviously, you know, we've had the side road zebra trials that have gone in Greater Manchester, that have had kind of really good findings on sort of drivers yielding to pedestrians and not increasing sort of risk to them. And there's also the kind of simple zebra crossings trial going on in Cardiff at the minute. But interestingly, most of the examples we saw weren't on side roads, so they've kind of really gone for it in that sense. And as far as we could observe, they were working really well. And from chatting to sort of clients of the Government of Jersey, they didn't seem to have sort of key issues with them. So it was really, really good thing to observe. Leanne, if you want to go on to the next slide. So these last few examples, they're perhaps, you know, they're things that we actually do have here. But what was really nice was for us to be able to sort of see them out in Jersey, photograph them, and then as we continue to kind of recommend them further, we could, you know, take the client back to these examples and say, you know, you're already doing this. It's not massively controversial, and you can continue to roll these out, and they work really well. So we've kind of top left there, we've got side road treatments, not quite a continuous footway, but really nice kind of narrowed junction radii, build outs with planting. And then you've got that kind of flush level crossing. We also had, this was in the village of St. Mary's, a big placemaking scheme that had been undertaken with this roundel, and they're hoping to roll this out to another village nearby called St. John's. If Leanne, you want to go to the next one. They've also got some pretty good modal filters. We were quite pleased with the ones that we saw. So they're a big fan of the rural modal filter, and our design recommendations certainly included rolling these out further, and you had kind of good clearance widths and things like that. And this one is an example near a school. So it created a really kind of successful route for people walking and cycling to that local school. And there were also examples sort of in more urban areas. So this is St. Helier on the right. A few of them needed a bit of work in terms of dropped curbs, but there were some pretty good examples there as well. Is that my last slide, Leanne? Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. That's my slides.
So yeah, hopefully some good examples that are a useful starting point for discussion.
Brilliant, thank you. And yeah, it'd be great to open up to discussion, questions, points, reflections. I just wanted to ask one question before we do that, which was, does Jersey basically operate a different highway? Does Jersey fall under the same laws as England, or is there a different set of traffic laws?
They follow the highway code, so they do follow the UK highway code, but there are some subtle differences, but they definitely take yeah, they take the highway code as theirs, but they do have some kind of nuances as well. And
the other one was around, you mentioned that you access the ANPR data. Is that standard? Do you have to kind of get special, how do you access that? Is that something that transport planners do routinely?
Yeah, so it's a type of survey, traffic survey, which is a set of cameras, so we will pay a third party to install them. So it's not something that's set up that we've accessed. It's actually something that we'll we'll kind of coordinate. So we look at all the main kind of routes in and out of the main kind of town centre, and we'll kind of put those up, and they'll be, obviously being Jersey, we looked at Saturday as well, because obviously it's being like a town centre destination. But yeah, we'll commission those surveys, and they're quite costly. So obviously the government of Jersey is paying for this, but quite often where we look at more citywide or town centre wide schemes, we'll get ANPR surveys, but they'll basically look at the car registration, so we know when they enter and exit and dwell time. Other surveys that we sometimes look at is kind of your more general ATC surveys, to have a look at, obviously a lot less sophisticated, but that'll just be looking at vehicle volumes and speeds, which is also really helpful for understanding kind of whether it's appropriate to have kind of cyclists in the carriageway, or whether we need kind of segregated infrastructure. But yeah, that's something that we commissioned.
That's really interesting. Right, so I'm going to ask Robert to come in, and then Ruth. But while they do, I think there's a question for us all to answer, which is, like, these guys have kind of gone to Jersey, come up with an active travel plan, but while they're there, they've gone, is lower speed limits on rural roads a good idea more generally, for instance, in England? So if anyone wants to express a view on that, I'd love to hear it. And so over to you, Robert.
I have a question about the desire line planning or demand assessment, effectively. How do you balance between what people are currently doing, because that's what they can do, rather than what they might want to do were there to be a much better option? So do they go to this retail area simply because there is a road that way, but actually there's something better or more attractive were there to be a route in place? So it's that kind of hidden demand rather than the straightforward, here's a desire line that we can recognise and see right now. How do you balance that kind of issue?
I can jump in if you want, Leanne. So we undertake a kind of everyday trips analysis. I am not an expert in this, and I won't pretend to be, but PGA has a bit of a kind of bespoke approach to this that sort of uses GIS to look at all the kinds of places people might be going, and that includes development sites as well, so that we're kind of future proofing the networks that we come up with. And on that basis, we will sort of take those core desire lines from start to finish, from places where people are traveling to and from, and map that to existing network, existing public rights of way, just all the kind of possible routes people could be taking. And then we sort of, from that, we're then left with a few different routes. And then, you know, I think as Leanne explained, when we got to Jersey, we sort of had 3 different potential routes for each destination that we wanted to reach. And then we were able to kind of cycle them ourselves and sort of, you know, add that actual human experience to the data analysis. So it's a starting point, but it doesn't always pick up the nuances. So it kind of helps us to not just go with what's already there and to start to think about alternative routes.
Thank you. Does that answer your question, Robert? Yeah. Ruth.
Hi, thanks for that. That's great. Hello. I filmed in Jersey, Bergerac, many years ago, the year that the seatbelt law came in. So that dates me, I think. And we were quite pleased not to have to wear them, I have to say, even then. 3 things. One-way streets, were they bi-directional for cycling? Is that an option there? In my day there, at every T-junction, everyone had to give way to each other. So it was much slower and people slowed down, rather like in Toronto when I was there. And the same on mini roundabouts. There was no kind of predominant right of way. So everyone slowed as they approached because they didn't know whose right of way it was. And it was a kind of after you, no, after you, no, after you. So was that attitude still there? Thank you.
Yeah, I guess in terms of the priority junctions, they did perhaps they've changed slightly, and there were kind of traditional ones that you see in the UK where the minor arm gives way. But I know that, Harriet, on one of your routes, perhaps you could come in here, there was did you say there was a kind of a roundabout kind of scheme where it's like people gave up priority depending on who arrived? I think that was on one of your routes.
Yeah, we saw a couple of examples again, which was completely new to us, of a filter in turn. So it sort of looks like a mini roundabout, but it does say filter in turn, so everybody takes turns, which, you know, when you've all arrived at the same time, it gets a little bit tricky, but the result is that everyone's very careful, very courteous. Cyclists were using it quite safely. So yes, there is still you kind of typical at your other junctions, it wasn't so obvious, but yeah, they'd seem to kind of bring in this idea of filtering in turn, which seemed to work quite well, and probably would have been, if we'd had a bit more time, one of our other examples that we included.
And
As
the
for
bidirectionals,
the one ways,
yes, sorry.
there were some examples of contraflow. It's certainly something that we included in our design recommendations. They also had, particularly in St Helier, they've got a one-way ring road for large parts, which is dual carriageway. So we've kind of had discussions around sort of road space reallocation and things like that to address that, and perhaps making it two-way again, because it does feel like a bit of a racetrack in places. But yeah, so kind of from just sort of simple painted line contraflow where your traffic speeds are suitable, to including things like you know, splitter islands at those priority junctions, just to give you a little bit more protection. I can't think of a specific example where that was included, but I know they were part of the wider design recommendations, and it's certainly something that we recommend for projects here as well.
Yeah, I think there was an example in St Helier where it was a trial scheme, and they changed, I think it was Hill Street, or Hill Road, I can't remember the exact name of the road now, but that had been changed to a one-way road, and then one of the lanes was then a bi-directional cycle track with the kind of the ones, so they were trialing it.
Thank you. A question for Claire then, or Claire could put to the general. Is this filter in turn a possibility for the whole country, or is it not Highway Code, Department for Transport, whoever's responsible? Anybody? Nope.
I've got a feeling Leicester have done something about automatically being able to go the wrong way down a one-way street. Certainly the Deliveroo guys do, but I think it's currently a thing. I'm sure Andy Salkeld mentioned that. I don't know if he's on today's call. Maybe on new developments, not sure.
Actually, I was asking about the filtering in turn. Norwich have one-way, bi-directional in one way, as far as I'm aware from my last trip there. But I was asking more about the filter in turn on mini roundabouts, because I think that's really a good thing for us all to want. Thank you.
Well, if anyone has any insight on filter in turn at roundabouts, then let's hear it. We're going to hear from Shane and then Ruth.
Hi, Claire. Just on the rural speed limits thing, I think I'd pick out the point of eliminating through traffic from minor rural roads and the modal filtering. And arguably, because Jersey is an island, there is no through traffic using that particular block of land to get from one major conurbation to another conurbation, or, you know, to get from a housing estate to some industrial park or that kind of thing. That I suspect that the nature of the traffic using those roads is naturally different to what many minor rural roads would be on the mainland. But that doesn't mean you can't create those conditions. But I would focus on the type of traffic using the road before putting the speed limit on it. That'd be just my 2 cents.
That sounds very smart. As you can tell, I'm not a traffic planner. Ruth and then David.
Thank you. I'm really intrigued by the sort of the almost casual ways you say you're doing APNR surveys, and I'd really like to understand sort of how much it costs and the size of settlement that you can do it on, and what the limitations and what it actually can do.
Leanne, are you all right to hop in here? You're probably a bit closer to this than me, just to drop you in it.
Yeah, sure. So I was just trying to find my mute button. The scope is generally down to, I mean, this is the first time that I have run ANPR cameras. Obviously, we've got colleagues here at PJ who've done it several times, so it's a learning experience for me as well. But in terms of, it's down to the traffic survey company and how many cameras they have, really. So obviously, if you've got multiple lanes and you need multiple cameras, it depends on how many days you're surveying, based on the camera availability. Also, technology fails as well, so you have to have spare cameras. In terms of the surveys, in terms of cost, again, it depends on how many days, how many cameras you need, but in the kind of tens of thousands of pounds, not hundreds of pounds. So
I'm just intrigued because our county has done major traffic studies for the LTP, and we've had a town transport plan that's supposedly been done using some sort of standard modelling with Saturn and all the rest of it. I think that there's been huge amounts of money spent on this, and not a whisper about the possibility of using APNR to look at who's actually rat running rather than going in and parking to do something. So if the cost may be really quite critical, and if you're talking about £10,000, I mean, as far as these major bits of work are concerned, that's actually really chicken feed.
Yeah, I mean, the Saturn models they're separate. A lot of the NPR studies can obviously feed into those, but the Saturn models are often owned by county councils as well. So they're normally kind of a separate. I'm
wondering whether we can persuade the county council that it ought to be incorporating this sort of analysis into their work, because they are, they're the budget holder, and they really ought to be interested not just for active travel, but across the piece, really.
Yeah, I guess with ANPR surveys, they're quite good at telling you what happens on the ground on a particular day, but obviously that won't pick up fluctuations. I guess with the good thing about models is that you can code in, say, putting in kind of modal filters, or you can put in some of these interventions and see how it's likely to kind of reassign traffic around on a citywide basis. So yeah, no, I mean, it's there's a lot of traffic survey companies out there, and obviously it's very, in terms of the cost, it's very dependent on the number of roads that you need to survey, number of cameras. It's very, one survey could be 3 times as much as another one, but it's certainly something you can get a quote for and see if that cost is something that's worth it.
Thanks.
Thank you. And then we'll hear from David, and then that'll be the last question, but if you've got more questions, do put them in the chat, and I'm sure Leanne and Harriet will answer them there, and then we'll move to Mark for the final section. David.
Thanks, really interesting presentation. I've never been to Jersey, but I wonder how far things have moved on from when the LC whips were done. I mean, I think they were started about 5 years ago, and whether this sort of desire line Strava type approach is an improvement. And because the LC whips seem to be not based on, some of them are based on propensity to cycle measures, which I know were pioneered, but others just seem to be picking up major corridors where they thought they might want to do something. I just wonder whether this more sophisticated approach is regarded as an improvement that we could use more widely.
I think it's certainly something that we see as kind of significantly improved the process. We do follow the general LSWIP process, but we kind of add in our own layers. So yeah, that includes the propensity to cycle to work, the propensity to cycle to school, but then we do this additional everyday trips analysis. If we can get hold of the data, we include Strava in that. So it's kind of a case of very much amalgamating all of those layers, but we will then also take our final network, we will always take that to stakeholders as well, for just kind of a common sense input from the people that know these areas as well. So, if we say, all the evidence says that this route here is really good, and then they just tell us no one's ever going to use that, and here's another one, we very much kind of incorporate that into the process. I'm trying to think off the top of my head which ones we've had published so far that I could kind of point as an example, but I can't think of any, but maybe I can go away and have a look and pop it in the chat if I can find it. But I think this kind of process that we've been using is still kind of developing, and a lot of those LSWIPs haven't been published as of yet. But I think a lot, broadly speaking, a lot of LSWIPs are going that way, and they're becoming kind of better evidence-based and not just about those key commuting corridors.
Thank you.
And it's worth mentioning that the kind of the guidance and how we undertake LC whips there's a refresh coming out shortly as well. So it's a moving document, and we're learning all the time as an industry. So yeah, it's.
Thank you.
And Leanne, Harriet, how did the piece of work go down? Like, our Jersey going, yep, we're doing this. This is happening.
Well, we're still kind of getting some comments back, but I think, in the talks we've had with them, they seemed ambitious, and as I've said, being able to kind of point at stuff they're already basically doing. I think to kind of the eastern end of the island, it's much more constrained. That's where we're going to have our controversial parts, where the kind of a bit more road space reallocation, slightly more extreme measures in terms of kind of curbing that traffic. But I think, yeah, that's, I don't know, Leanne, if you feel different, but I think all the conversations are very positive. And I think, you know, it's such a kind of big industry for them, cycling, and they're seeing more and more e-bikes and things like that as well, and they really do appreciate that they've kind of been designing for the car to the detriment of people walking and cycling. So I'm optimistic, but I'm always vaguely optimistic.
One to watch then, it sounds like. Leanne, anything to add to that?
Yeah, just that there's obviously the people that we're working with at the government of Jersey seem really ambitious, but obviously there's always the politics that's around it, and obviously go through the consultation periods, but there's definitely an ambition, and they're putting the funding into these studies, so that's a positive sign. They're really looking to push and be aspirational, so hopefully, but we'll see where it goes.
Excellent. One to keep an eye on, and there's definitely a few people who've signed up for holidays to Jersey on the basis of your talk, I think. So, and if anyone has any suggestions for what I liked about asking Leanne and Harriet was it's a bit more of a rural setting, and you know, we do focus a lot on towns and cities, which is right and interesting. But if people have ideas for other rural locations that are doing interesting things that we could hear from on Active Travel Cafe, then do suggest them either in the chat or email us if it pops into your head at another time. So I'm going to ask Mark to finish us off with his infrastructure clinic, the good, the bad and the interesting. Mark, over to you.
Right, let's share. Okay, hopefully that's now sharing.
That is.
It's a really short one this week. Last week was quite long, involved, technical and difficult. So would anybody like to hazard a guess? What is the connection between Glasgow, Northeast London and Malmo? Please just shout out and unmute and cause chaos for a minute.
The letter O.
It's infrastructure. It's infrastructure.
Refuse cassettes.
It's good, but not right.
Tarmac, green tarmac.
Green tarmac. No.
Bin lorries.
No.
Those little rests that you put your foot on when you're at the lights.
Ah, Simon's got it. So here is the connection. So here is Skepsbron, very close to Malmo station, and a very utilitarian and straightforward, nice little footrest there. Here is your Waltham Forest Clacton for the week, Rockholt Road in Waltham Forest. However, it wasn't the first one in England. The first one in England, it wasn't that one, that was in Glasgow, that's the South City Way. And Glasgow has got loads and loads and loads of these. Now, obviously, we'd all like the traffic lights to change as we approach them. It's not going to happen all the time. So a nice little footrest there and a hand rest so you can take the weight off. The first one in England was actually here, Simon. We beat Waltham Forest and Havering on our flagship 200 metres of cycle track. So there you go. Footrest for cycles. Let's have more of them, please. That's it. Any comments are welcome.
Comments on that before the comments come in. How common or otherwise are they, Mark? I mean, are these like, are they as rare as hen's teeth, or?
They really are. I mean, the one that we put in Havering, we basically used the same model as Glasgow, and Glasgow have been putting them in for some time. So Glasgow seems to be a UK hotspot for them. There's somebody in Waltham Forest who's obviously seen them because there's a few around in Waltham Forest. So, yeah, that's about as far as I found in the UK. So I'd love to know if there's more in the UK, because I'll probably then have to put them on the list and go and visit them.
Well, we've got two hands up, so let's see, Simon and then Max.
There is a kind of informal one as you cross away from Hackney City Farm. Loads of people put their foot on the metal railing there. That's the perfect height, but because it hasn't got any anti-grip kind of skid on it, once in icy conditions, my foot went straight over it, as did I. So I think properly designed versions good, improperly designed versions very, very risky.
Max.
On a similar theme, I was going to ask if you or anyone have seen examples where it's not just doing that function, because I'm thinking of another informal one. When you come out of Hyde Park, there's there's gates that I often hold on to while I'm waiting for the light. But it'd be interesting to know how you could, or if other cities have incorporated it with other bits of infrastructure, so that it's not just a standalone bit of street furniture, that it could, you know, could have other people ever incorporated into other things.
I think as you go around, you see people using curbs and, as Simon said, bits of guardrail and gates and everything else. So there's lots of it. I sometimes leave my feet on the pedals and grab the push button. So yeah, but I think people informally use it. But it's one of those little things. I know it's kind of not core infrastructure, but it's a nice little thing to have. And really, it's the kind of thing we can incorporate in most schemes, I think, for no money at all. I'll put the product of the Glasgow/Havering one in the chat if anyone else is interested.
Graham and then Robert.
Yeah, have you checked on these whether you can reach the beg button if you've got your foot on the footrest?
Well, the ones in Glasgow and the one in Havering have got detectors, so you don't need to press the button. And I think the one in Malmo, I'll go back to, let me check. Now Malmo does have a push button and it's right on there. So yes, you have to position them. Certainly when we put the one in Havering, it was me, the contractor and a bike physically trying to set the thing up. There was no instructions, but we got it right.
Thank you. And Robert, did you have a question or point?
It was actually something very similar. There's lots of beg buttons that I can't reach if I'm sat on my cargo bike. It's just impossible without sticking the cargo bike into the middle of the traffic. And I wonder why those footrests, just why would you want them? We've got enough steelwork and clutter around in our pedestrian and cycling zones, and they get clipped and destroyed by cars on a regular basis. This is just another target, isn't it? Is there a real positive benefit?
I mean, certainly the ones that I've shown examples of, I've used all of those. They're probably not in the firing line of traffic in those particular cases. They're away from the live traffic side, and it's just nice. You can roll up to the stop line, put your foot on the thing without having to lean right over, or you can hold on to them if you clipped in or whatever. It's probably no different to having a high curb. You see a lot of those in the cycle tracks in central London. People stop at the lights, put the foot down on the high curb, just so you don't have to have that last stretch. So if and at the risk of telling people how to set their bikes up, I was always told to have it so you're kind of on tiptoe-ish, and it's just a little bit of comfort. Yeah, it's clutter, but it is clutter that's doing a job, and all the best clutter should do a job, preferably 2 jobs.
Oh, that's a good rule of thumb. Didn't know about that. And one thing from me, Mark, which I don't this isn't putting you on the spot, but if people had a topic that they'd like you to focus on, would you take requests on the basis that you have the final say and can say no if you want?
Yeah, sure. I've got a list, so I can add things in and juggle them around as the program dictates.
Yeah, so if you've got a thing that you'd like Mark to focus on and bring his expertise to, then you know, can put it in the chat. We're going to be finishing in a moment or two, but if you're a regular, then Mark is going to be joining us on a semi-regular basis, so you can always email us. So yeah, I mean, my one, Mark, would be those you know, those little like metal grooves on stairs that help you get your bike up stairs. Like, they just seem such a minuscule amount to spend that makes unaccessible infrastructure a bit more accessible.
They're no good for my tricycle.
No, and also,
at all.
Sorry, Claire, just to come in on that one. Richmond Council did negotiate with Network Rail to put them in on all their rail staircases. But where they have them in Holland and they're made in the concrete already there, often if you've got panniers on, you have to actually tip the bike quite far over because it's, you know, it's too close to the wall. So they're not the best.
They're better than nothing
in some ways. Yeah,
they're better than nothing. So Mark is taking requests for things. If people have a topic they'd like his expert view on, then let's hear it. So if there are no more points or questions, I'm going to finish this up. There was a bit of chat in the chat, Harriet and Leanne, about the Strava, using Strava for data, and I don't know if you wanted to answer that point at all, which is like, is that a bit of a kind of exclusive source. It's only going to give you one view. Don't know whether you had a view on that.
Yeah.
I guess it's worth
do you want to go, Leanne?
Sorry. I guess it's just worth mentioning that it was an additional layer because of the nature of Jersey, and it wouldn't be kind of part of the standard practice. We obviously looked at census data where people were traveling for work. We looked at everyday trips, looking at where origins and destinations are, drawing the line between them, and then Strava was an additional layer. So yeah, we completely agree, it's not representative of everyday trips. It was just an important factor in Jersey. So yeah, sorry Harriet, I spoke over you there. I don't know if you have anything else to add.
No, it was just, I was going to say exactly the same. We've also kind of used it in sort of places like West Northamptonshire, but the idea, well, we use it when our local authority clients have a login. So in terms of kind of purchasing and costs, I can't come back on that one, unfortunately, but it's something that local authorities quite often have access to. So yeah, just a useful extra layer, and aware it's not covering everyone.
Brilliant. And just the last chance now for anyone to share any news. There were a few people who joined us through the session, so if there's any last minute news updates while you're thinking about whether you've got one, I'll just tell you about next week. We've got, as I said earlier, the Oxford kind of spotlight on Oxford. We quite like to do spotlights on different places in the country, so that should be interesting because there's a lot happening there. I think Ruth, you wanted to come in on a little news update before we finish.
I'm actually trying to find who it was. So this week, Claire and I were both on Possible, who some of you might know, Leo Murray often presents here. They had a webinar on car-free cities, which was actually really, really interesting. And Seb Dance spoke at great length. And then, of course, I'm now struggling to remember the names of the other people, but it was deputy mayors from places like Paris, Spain, somewhere in America, I think. Oh, New York, obviously. It did seem, though, that in New York and Paris, whoever was the deputy mayor or in charge had autonomy to be able to do that. Claire did ask the question, but most of our questions are going to be responded to in writing. So we might come up with that one, because it is obviously the problem in London, as we all know, is it's 33 separate boroughs. But I'll do proper feedback another time, although someone says Leo is here and he might, but although he wasn't on it. Anyway, it was excellent, and I recommend signing up to Possible events in the future because they're very good, aren't they, Leo?
Oh, bless you. Thank you, Ruth. Yeah, I've been here the whole time, but I've been cycling. That's how I mainly have to tune into these. Yeah, thanks. It was great, wasn't it? It was brilliant. I'm not responsible, but I'll pass that back to colleagues. Thanks.
Yeah, and so we'll look out for those questions that get answered, and we can circulate them. And those are the kinds of things we could potentially put up on our new website. So thank you everyone for joining us. That's the end of this week's Active Travel Cafe, and I hope to see you next week, but if not, another time.